It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Kings don't step down quietly. They don't vanish behind carefully worded statements and polite smiles. And they certainly don't do it at the exact moment the world starts asking the wrong questions. So let me ask you this. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. What kind of betrayal is so severe that it forces a reigning monarch to walk away from the throne and hand power to his son immediately? Because that is exactly what people inside royal circles say happened here. Not illness, not age, not exhaustion, something else, something explosive, and it centers on Prince Harry. Now, before you dismiss this as just another chapter in a long-running family feud, slow down. Because what unfolded behind palace walls wasn't a public argument or another awkward interview. It was a private reckoning, one that shook the very structure of the monarchy and triggered a chain reaction no one expected. Charles didn't fade away. He abdicated. And William didn't hesitate. Think about that for a second. This is a family that plans everything years in advance. Decades, even. Every transition is rehearsed. Every speech written long before it's ever spoken. Yet suddenly, the crown changes hands with breathtaking speed. No gradual easing in. No extended period of adjustment. Just a sharp transfer of power and an eerie silence where explanations should be. Why? Because whatever Charles discovered, whatever crossed his desk, or whatever reached his ears, made staying on the throne more dangerous than leaving it. And that's where Harry comes in. For years, the public narrative painted him as the wounded spare, the misunderstood son, the man who simply wanted out. But what if that story was incomplete? What if the real issue wasn't that Harry left the institution, but that he took something with him? Information, access, trust. Ask yourself this. Why would a king endure scandal, criticism, even humiliation, but draw the line here? Royal insiders hint at a moment. A specific moment. A phone call, a document, a revelation that made it clear the damage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was done, and it couldn't be undone. That's when Charles made the unthinkable decision. And William stepped forward not as a brother, but as a protector of the crown. Here's the uncomfortable part. When power is threatened, family becomes secondary. The monarchy doesn't survive on love. It survives on control, secrecy, and loyalty. Break one of those, and the system reacts fast, brutally fast. So as William was crowned with astonishing speed, one name quietly disappeared from future plans. Not mentioned, not defended, not protected. Prince Harry. No statements, no explanations, just distance. And that leads to the question no one wants to ask out loud. Was Harry pushed out, or was he being contained? Because what forced Charles to step aside wasn't public pressure. It was something far more dangerous. And once William saw it, there was no turning back. Picking up from that moment, because once William saw it, everything accelerated. The first sign that something was very wrong came from how fast everything moved. Not days, not weeks, hours. Royal transitions are supposed to feel ceremonial, almost slow on purpose. A dignified passing of the torch. This wasn't that. This felt urgent. Surgical. Like damage control. Ask yourself this. When has the palace ever rushed? Exactly. Behind closed doors, aides weren't whispering, they were scrambling. Emergency meetings stacked on top of each other. Lawyers brought in who usually never leave the shadows. Advisors who had served 3 generations suddenly asked to sign fresh confidentiality agreements. That alone tells you this wasn't about optics. It was about containment. And at the center of it all was Charles. Sources close to the situation say the abdication wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Not a man collapsing under pressure, but a man making a calculation. One final move to protect something larger than himself. The crown. Because here's the contradiction most people missed. If Charles were truly weak, he would have clung to power. Delayed. Deflected. Let time soften the blow. Instead, he did the opposite. He removed himself instantly, before questions could metastasize, before blame could settle where it didn't belong. That's not surrender. That's control. And the moment William stepped in, the tone changed. No softness. No ambiguity. No talk of healing or reconciliation. This wasn't a brother inheriting a title. This was a king assuming command. William had spent years being portrayed as the calm one, the stable one, the reluctant heir who preferred family to conflict. But power has a way of stripping illusions away. When the full scope of what had happened became clear, hesitation vanished. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because whatever Harry had done, or allowed to happen, wasn't viewed as a personal betrayal anymore. It was seen as a structural threat. Something that could weaken the monarchy not today, but years from now. Ask yourself, what kind of information is dangerous enough that a king stepping down is the safer option? Not gossip. Not resentment. Not feelings. Infrastructure-level damage. William understood something Charles did not want to say out loud. That once a certain line is crossed, you don't argue. You don't negotiate. You act. That's why there was no public reckoning. No televised confrontation. No dramatic statement. Because acknowledging the full truth would have caused more harm than silence ever could. And then came the quiet decision that shocked even longtime royal watchers. Harry wasn't just excluded. He was removed from consideration entirely. No advisory role. No future pathway back. No contingency plans. It was as if the institution itself had decided, this variable can no longer be part of the equation. And the scariest part? Harry wasn't warned. He found out the same way the rest of the world did, by watching doors close that never reopened. But what William ordered next wasn't just symbolic. It was decisive. And when word of that first directive began circulating inside palace walls, even loyal insiders froze. Because it wasn't about punishment. It was about exile. And what Harry did when he realized what was happening would send this story spiraling in a direction no one was prepared for. The realization didn't arrive with a phone call. There was no warning, no private briefing, no gentle intermediary easing the blow. It arrived through absence, invitations that never came, meetings that vanished from schedules, names removed from documents that once included him by default. That's how Harry knew. And here's the part that unsettled even seasoned palace insiders. Exile didn't look like anger. It looked like procedure. Cold, efficient, almost bureaucratic, as if the decision had already been modeled, rehearsed, and approved long before the public ever sensed trouble. Ask yourself something. When institutions move this smoothly, is it really spontaneous? Or has the trigger simply been pulled? Behind the scenes, William's first order wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Communications were rerouted. Access was narrowed. Layers of insulation were added between the crown and anyone considered unpredictable. And in that new structure, Harry didn't fit anywhere. Not as a working royal. Not as a family representative. Not even as a symbolic bridge. This wasn't banishment in the medieval sense. There were no guards escorting him away. No dramatic announcements. Instead, it was modern exile. The kind that leaves you technically free, but permanently irrelevant. And Harry felt it immediately. Sources say he reached out. More than once. Messages that went unanswered. Calls redirected. Familiar voices suddenly replaced with formal ones. Polite. Distant. Final. Here's the contradiction no one talks about. Harry had always claimed he wanted freedom from the institution. Independence. Distance. Yet when the institution withdrew from him completely, the reaction wasn't relief. It was panic. Because there's a difference between leaving on your own terms and realizing you've been locked out. Think about it. Which hurts more, walking away, or discovering you were never given the choice? What followed was a scramble. A recalibration. Harry, for the first time, faced a reality where he no longer mattered to the system he once defined himself against. And that's when desperation entered the picture. Not public desperation. Private. Conversations changed tone. Language sharpened. The story shifted from explanation to justification. From healing to defense. And then came the move that shocked even those who believed they had seen everything. Harry didn't retreat. He pushed back. Quietly at first. Then louder. Then in ways that crossed lines no one believed he would cross again. Ask yourself this. When someone realizes exile is permanent, what do? Disappear? Or detonate? Because from William's perspective, this wasn't about a brother acting out. It was about risk escalation. Every move Harry made after that only confirmed the decision to cut ties completely. The walls didn't just go up. They thickened. And somewhere in the middle of that silent war, Harry made a choice, a single decision, that transformed him from a problem into a liability. That was the moment William stopped reacting and started preparing. Because what Harry set in motion next didn't just threaten reputations. It threatened stability. And once that line was crossed, there was no path back, only consequences. The shift was subtle at first, so subtle that most people missed it. Harry's language changed. The way he spoke about the past, the way he framed motives, the way responsibility was reassigned with surgical precision. What once sounded like grief began to resemble leverage. Ask yourself this. Why does someone revisit old wounds only after they realize the door is permanently closed? Because that's when stories stop being cathartic and start being transactional. Inside palace walls, alarms went off. Not because of what was said publicly, but because of what was hinted at privately. References to conversations that were never meant to leave certain rooms. Allusions to knowledge that was supposed to be compartmentalized. It wasn't the content that frightened people. It was the confidence. Confidence suggests possession. And possession changes everything. William understood something immediately. This was no longer about smoothing things over or waiting for the storm to pass. This was about preventing escalation before it took a form that could no longer be controlled. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Institutions don't fear criticism. They fear unpredictability. And Harry had become unpredictable. Every appearance, every interview, every carefully worded pause now carried an undercurrent. A silent message, I know more than you think. That kind of posture forces responses. It corners decision-makers. It turns patience into liability. So William did what leaders do when the stakes are existential. He drew a final boundary. No more intermediaries. No more soft language. No more ambiguity. The relationship wasn't being paused. It was being closed. From that moment on, Harry wasn't treated as a disgruntled family member. He was treated as a variable to be neutralized, not destroyed, not humiliated, simply removed from any position where proximity could become influence. And here's where the irony deepens. The more Harry spoke about freedom, the tighter the system closed around itself. The more he claimed independence, the more isolated he became. Because freedom without access is just noise. Ask yourself another question. If you believed your voice was being erased, wouldn't you try to make it louder? That's exactly what happened. The pacing changed. The tone sharpened. The implication grew heavier. And with every step forward, Harry unknowingly validated William's fears. The institution didn't need proof of intent anymore. It had proof of trajectory. And trajectory is everything. By then, contingency plans were already active. Not reactive plans. Pre-written ones. Ones designed for scenarios no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. Scenarios where a former insider becomes a destabilizing force. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because once those plans are triggered, there is no off switch. No apology that reverses them. No reconciliation that resets the board. Harry had crossed from being a family problem into becoming a systemic risk. And William, now fully crowned, understood that history would judge him not on compassion, but on control. So he authorized the final measure, the one that ensured distance would never again be mistaken for weakness. And when Harry realized what had just been set in motion, it was already too late to stop it. Because the crown wasn't responding anymore. It was executing. By the time Harry understood what was happening, the language around him had already changed. Not emotionally. Administratively. That's how you know a decision is final. Because when something becomes procedural, it's no longer personal. It's no longer debated. It's processed. Requests were no longer reviewed by people who knew him. They were handled by offices. Statements weren't discussed. They were screened. Even silence was no longer accidental. It was policy. Ask yourself this. How terrifying must it feel to realize you're no longer being argued with? Because the argument is already over. From William's side, this wasn't vengeance. It was prevention. Every leader eventually faces a moment where delay becomes negligence, where compassion becomes exposure. And William had crossed that threshold. The final measure wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with trumpets or headlines. It came quietly, buried beneath technical language and constitutional framing. But its effect was devastating. Harry was formally severed from the inner circle, not publicly disowned, not legally erased, but rendered permanently external. And here's the cruel genius of it. Nothing about Harry's daily life appeared to change. He could still speak, still travel, still appear, but his words no longer carried institutional weight. His proximity no longer translated into access. The crown had insulated itself so completely that even truth, real or perceived, could no longer land where it might do damage. That's modern exile. Freedom without influence. Voice without reach. And it broke something. Because Harry had always believed the story would force a reckoning. That exposure would lead to apology. That pressure would reopen doors. Instead, it did the opposite. The more pressure applied, the more the system hardened. Ask yourself, what do you do when your leverage stops working? You escalate. That's when the whispers intensified. The suggestion that something bigger was coming. That this wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of a counterstrike. And inside the palace, that possibility was anticipated long before it became visible. William didn't wait. He expanded the perimeter, not just around himself, but around the narrative. Allies were briefed. Lines were reinforced. Future scenarios mapped. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Because once someone believes they have nothing left to lose, they become dangerous. And Harry was approaching that edge. What he didn't realize was that every move he was considering had already been accounted for. Every path forward already blocked. Every possible escalation already neutralized before it could fully form. The Crown had done this before. History is full of royal figures who mistook proximity for power, who believed blood alone guaranteed influence, who learned too late that institutions outlive individuals. And now Harry stood at the same crossroads. Except this time, there would be no dramatic downfall, no public trial, no redemption arc, just distance. Permanent, calculated, absolute. And as the final channels closed and the last informal ties went silent, Harry faced a reality more brutal than banishment. He wasn't being punished. He was being forgotten. But what he chose to do next, when silence became unbearable, would test the limits of even the Crown's control. And that's where this story takes its most unpredictable turn.